Nothing says Labor Day like pool parties, fireworks, and knowing you don't have to go to school or work. Despite the crazy chaotic year known as 2020, for the most part the holiday will remain intact, just with masks and a large ruler in between people. Thank goodness Throwback Weekend hasn't been infected, and once again, NASCAR's best drivers and teams will be rocking the old school looks and retro paint. So therefore, it's time to turn the ignition and tier rank the 2020 NASCAR Darlington Throwbacks. So compared to the previous two throwback installments, this third one's a little bit different, as I am going to be tier ranking them into 5 categories. And now, there are a lot of people out there that have completely different guidelines as me. They see their favorite throwback paint schemes, and if the car itself looks good, they're going to love it and it's going to be one of the better throwbacks in their opinion. But honestly, I'm more of a guy that looks for accuracy. I'm going to tell you this, there's going to be some great paint schemes, designs that I personally like, that are going to be low on this list because 1, they either screwed up the color or the font isn't the same as the actual car. In my opinion, the highest bar of throwbacks are the ones that look almost exactly like the cars that drove 10, 20, even 30 years before them. And therefore, the 5 tiers I have set out are this. The first one's the colorblind tier. These are typically the worst kinds of designs, as you have schemes like the Ryan Newman car last year and the Matt Kenseth throwback from a couple years ago. Typically, the sponsor will completely screw up this design and it will look nothing like the actual car. It makes you think even Helen Keller could design these cars better. The second one is the faded paint category. Typically this is for the smaller teams, as some of them use paint schemes that were used a couple years ago and they don't look as good. And then of course you have like Love's when they reuse their paint scheme over and over without changing it. And then the middle one is the historically inaccurate category. But chances are a sponsor placement looks bad, or the font looks horrible, and that really puts them in this middling category and it ruins it a bit in my opinion. And then the next highest tier, we've got the time capsule tier. This tier is mainly for some of the paint schemes that they're not the greatest, but they do a really good job and there's only a couple minor flaws to the design. And then finally, the high bar, the history on wheels tier. Almost everything about this car is perfect, and the paint scheme looks absolutely awesome, and it's something you are going to remember for years on end. That's what gets you in this high bar of excellence. So leading off, we have Quinn Houff's throwback that goes all the way back to 1936. And you may be wondering, why? Because NASCAR wasn't even established until 1948. Well, this is a throwback to a Ford V8 Roadster which Mike Milton drove to victory at the Daytona Beach Course. Now, when doing research, I couldn't find the exact car they were modeling off of, which makes it really hard to analyze this car. But then looking at the car from a closer glance, it does not look like it is throwing back to any particular car, or at least it's not accurate. As the black fades to orange, you can tell there's a picture of the beach where you've got a guy waving a checkered flag, and that just tells me right there, this is definitely inaccurate. I mean, you have some cool things, like the 23 on the C-pillar and then Mike Milton's name above the door. But just seeing that picture, it honestly ruins it for me, and honestly, I'm gonna rank this one pretty low. I'll go ahead and put it in the faded paint category, as I can tell they were trying to do something, but it just doesn't look that good, and it does not look accurate at all. Alrighty, for the first time we get a discount tire throwback for Brad Keselowski. A sponsor that has a lot of tread saved up, so this should be an exceptional design, something truly unique that we've never seen on Brad Keselowski's number 2 car. This car commemorates Brad Keselowski's memorable championship season a decade ago, and I know I had some great memories seeing this car at Gateway. But after that, this is the exact same standard discount tire scheme he currently runs except with the side skirts raised. And that is one of the major downsides to rarely changing the primary paint scheme. I would put this car in the faded paint category, but the thing is, it is very accurate, and really the only flaw is they just did it too soon. They should have waited until maybe a couple years down the road where Discount Tire tweaked up the paint scheme a little bit. So I'm going to give this car the benefit of the doubt and put it in the time capsule tier. Austin Dillon, a driver we're typically used to seeing pay tribute to either Richard Childress or an off-brand Dale Sr. scheme, because we all know running the black and silver number 3 would trigger the Dale Sr. fan base to death. But in 2020, this time the older Dillon pays tribute to the last American hero and NASCAR Hall of Famer Junior Johnson. The Camaro is modeled off of Johnson's Holly Farms 1963 Impala. And as I'm looking at these two cars side by side, Richard Childress Racing absolutely nailed this car. Everything from the font, the Chevrolet logo, and the stripes on the hood, it mimics exactly what the Moonshiner drove across the Carolinas. American Ethanol, they seem to always hit a home run with their throwback paint schemes, and this one is no exception. This one definitely goes in the time capsule on wheels tier. Last September was a very rare strikeout for Busch Beer. Even Joey Logano ran a better Kevin Harvick throwback scheme. Let that sink in. Fortunately, the St. Louis born and raised brewery comes back, this time with a bang. Now, it's not throwing back to any particular car in this era, but rather the NASCAR Busch Series as a whole. This car is a part of a marketing campaign by Busch, as they're going to release a limited edition retro Busch can design, which should be available at your local Walmarts and local grocery stores. And looking at the picture, the cans are really cool, as they have all the Busch Series champions, which includes Kevin Harvick. And actually, on Kevin Harvick's car, on the rear bumper, you have his commemoration of winning the 01 and 06 championships, as well as the Busch Series logo. Now, while it doesn't commemorate any specific paint scheme, this is still a memorable car, and therefore it's going in the time capsule tier, as you're going to remember this one for a while. Ryan Newman has seemingly been on the wrong side of the throwback game almost every single year. All those times where Caterpillar copied off of Austin Dillon. And then you had this monstrosity, which was the Oscar Mayer equivalent of putting peanut butter and jelly on a ham sandwich. Oscar Mayer, they completely butchered one of Mark Martin's most iconic paint schemes of all time. But in this chaotic 2020 year, Ryan Newman will actually drive a decent looking throwback. It's a nod to his days of wheeling the hell out of Silver Crown cars. Despite a challenge from Russ Gamester, Ryan Newman claimed the 1999 USAC Championship driving the orange and blue design. And going from a Silver Crown car, the Roush designers did a great job replicating it to the bulky NASCAR stock car. But this is one of the better looking, more accurate Ryan Newman paint schemes, and therefore I'm going to put this one in the time capsule tier. Tommy Bowen Racing is back. Therefore, they get to run another throwback to the enriched history of the Baldwins. This in particular car is a throwback to one of Baldwin Sr.'s modified schemes. And you can definitely tell they got the font right, they got the color right, and it is going to stand out with 500 miles of racing. Even though their only TV time is going to be going a couple laps down. But this is a major outlier to the smaller teams' cars, as a lot of them, honestly, I don't care for, as I feel like it's more of a mockbuster. But this one, it's completely original, completely a part of the team's history, and this one's going to rank in that time capsule tier, as it is one beauty and a staple to Tommy Bowen Racing. The Caterpillar number 8 has a rather unconventional look this Labor Day weekend, mainly because they actually came up with an original design and also didn't do a generic company throwback. The Ray Bestis colors replaced the traditional cat black and red, in a design mimicking Jeff Burton's 1995 Ford Thunderbird. Now, this car makes sense, especially considering Jeff Burton was a former driver for Caterpillar and the scheme share a number. And as a critic of this car, Richard Childress Racing got the colors pretty well. And now, the one thing really hindering this scheme going into the History on Wheels tier is the number font. They got the font right, but the problem is it's leaning in a bit of a different direction. And then I'd say another thing that ruins it happens to be the A-pillar, as I think the yellow stands out a little bit too much compared to the Austin Dillon car. Still a great paint scheme, but it could be a tad bit better, so I'm going to put this one in the time capsule tier. Still a great paint scheme. Hendrick Motorsports is of course celebrating Jimmy Johnson, with 3 of its 4 cars celebrating the 7-time champion. And ironically, one of those drivers not running a Jimmy Johnson throwback is Jimmy Johnson. But more on that later. Chase Elliott is going to sport the 2009 primary low scheme on his Chevy Camaro, a season in which Johnson himself won 7 races and surpassed Cale Yarborough for most consecutive NASCAR championships in a row. And as a 9-year-old at that time, this car definitely gives me a bit of nostalgia. Napa Auto Parts did a great job with the execution, but there is one issue with this car that kind of irritates me a bit. And that's, of course, they had to use the ugly looking 9 font on this car. Seriously, imagine how much better this car would have looked with the number 9 in the traditional Hendrick styling. And now I'll give him a bit of a pass because thinking about it, I think the Hendrick font would look a bit smaller and not as good as the one they used. So therefore, I'm going to put it in the time capsule tier, and so far Hendrick Motorsports is off to a strong start. Eric Almirola is going for the Strike Sunday with this Go Bowling throwback. A red design reverting back to Fireball Roberts and his historic 1957 campaign. And now, I can understand why it's fallen a bit under the radar, but then looking closely at this car and the car Fireball Roberts drove, the attention to detail on this car is incredible. You've obviously got the horsepower of this car on the hood, something that'll definitely trigger the big motor small blade crowd. But then on the side, they even got some of the minor logos accurate, and the Ford font style on the back of the car is also definitely correct. I don't know too much about Fireball Roberts, but I'm telling you, this paint scheme, it was absolutely done right by Stewart-Haas Racing, and it makes me want to look more into his career. So I'm going to put this one in the History on Wheels tier. For sure, one of the better throwbacks in this class. For Denny Hamlin, he'll hope to deliver yet another Darlington win for FedEx. But this time, he'll be doing so in this company throwback. Going by the full name Federal Express, the company began in 1973, and this purple and white design pays homage to over 500,000 past and present FedEx team members. And ironically, the winner of that season's Southern 500 was Cale Yarborough. And so it's cool to see the 11 font pay homage to the similar style Yarborough drove on that Sunday afternoon. And with mixing company history with NASCAR history, I have to say it's one of the better company throwbacks I've seen in a long time. So this one definitely going in the time capsule tier. For the third consecutive season, Ryan Blaney sports the Menards colors on his Penske Ford Mustang. And contrasting from throwbacks past, there is a massive lack of yellow on this car as the base color. As before you had the highlighter yellow era, you had Paul Menard, the son of John Menard, looking to make big money in the stock car realm. And on September 27, 2003, Menard took this navy blue turtle wax Chevrolet to ARCA Victory Lane. And so, looking at the Menards navy blue paint scheme, I definitely wish they used this car more often. It really fits well with the neon yellow, orange, and red, and then you have the green outline that really stands out and makes the 12 look awesome. In terms of accuracy, there's next to nothing wrong with this paint scheme. So in terms of tier ranking this car, I'm not going to put it in the time capsule tier, because I know a lot of Ryan Blaney's annoying fans would get on to me. After all, I found nothing wrong with this car. So I'm going to put this car in the History on Wheels tier. Definitely not a disappointing Ryan Blaney scheme. Geico is one of the highest paying and more prominent sponsors in the NASCAR garage. And once again, this throwback design on Ty Dillon's number 13 is of high standard. A part of the championship theme, they're bringing back the old Germain styling found on its trucks during the mid-2000s and early 2010s. An era in which Todd Bodine was the star of the series, and the paint scheme mimics his 2010 truck championship, his and Germain's second accolades. Germain Racing has a history of exceptional throwbacks, and this one's no exception. So this car is definitely going in the time capsule tier. It's definitely one of the better looking cars, and it's going to look great in the 500-mile heat of Darlington. Clint Bowyer is going to be sporting the Peak antifreeze colors, and this car throws back to one of NASCAR's most prominent names. Kyle Petty most famously drove this car to victory at the Rockingham Speedway, a track he dominated in the early 90s and won nearly 40% of his career victories at that track. And with this car, they got the font right, they got the logos right, they got the colors right. The only thing bringing this car down a bit is it looks like there was a bit of purple on this car, which isn't on Clint Bowyer's Ford Mustang. But it's still a genuinely great throwback, so this one's going to go in the time capsule tier. Hopefully Peak Antifreeze can keep up and maybe run the 1989 design next season. The Red Rooster is back. Brennan Poole's Chevrolet Camaro has the classic cream and red look driven in the mid-80s by Ricky Rudd. And looking at this paint scheme, you can tell Rick Ware Racing put in the effort to pull off this throwback. The only issue is, by the Chevrolet Camaro they have a bit of red, which historically isn't supposed to be there. But the thing that makes this car stand out is definitely the font, as they not only use the correct one, but it's a bit slanted like on the original car. Once again, another great throwback by a smaller team, definitely worthy of the time capsule tier. Kyle Busch will be throwing back to a guy he wrecked at a Bristol truck race. Just maybe this is something that'll help revert his luck. This paint scheme was actually the first M&M's chocolate themed paint scheme, and it introduced the template still used on the primary 18 today. And so with the similar sponsorship, M&M's did a great job replicating this car, and the coolest thing about this car is they actually got the Yates font correct. You'd think they would have used the standard 18 as that one's iconic to Kyle Busch, but nope, they went out of their way and used the correct font, which that's something you gotta applaud a sponsor for. The only thing I hate is how a mediocre cup racer with 3 wins is getting celebrated like this, especially on Champions Weekend of all things. I mean, they could have thrown back to the Kyle Busch Crispy car this weekend, but that'll probably be for another time. But after that, M&M's and Joe Gibbs Racing absolutely nailed this car, and it is definitely going in the history on wheels tier. Third place MTJ is running a rather familiar paint scheme during the Southern 500. From an outside glance, this is a copy and paste from 2019. Albeit the meaning is a bit different, as this car is supposed to resemble something that Hank Parker Jr. drove in 2003. Considering the heritage of this name, that would make a good future disappearance episode. It was one of the first primary sponsorship endeavors for Bass Pro Shops. So in terms of the paint scheme, it looks like it's exactly from 2019, but I have the die cast in front of me, and you can tell there's a little bit more red on the 2020 version than on the 2019 car. And then the hood logo is a bit different, as it's a bit more old school than the one that was used last season. The only thing really bad about this car is on the side of the car, it's supposed to be the Bass Pro Shops logo like it was in the picture, but instead they have the Tracker Boats logo. So with that, I'm going to have to put it in the historically inaccurate tier. It's a good paint scheme, but that one inaccuracy kinda hinders it and makes it look more like last year's scheme than something different. You want an example of how stale throwback weekend can be sometimes? Just look at this car Eric Jones is driving. There are several iconic JGR schemes, and yet Sport Clips chooses to race a random Tony Stewart car from 2005. And to make matters worse, this isn't even accurate, as the orange is replaced by the Sport Clips red. I'm looking at the 2 paint schemes, and you can tell they almost look completely different because of that color. And it's a true shame, because this car would make for a great alternate scheme, and it's a hell of a lot better than this primary design. But as a throwback, it just looks so bad, so inaccurate. So guess what? This is going in the colorblind tier. This is not a good throwback in any way, shape, or form. Wood Brothers Racing. We all know they can craft such wonderful reversions to the past with its great history. And unsurprisingly, the 2020 edition is another great masterpiece to the Wood Brothers lineup. This car goes back to the days of Tiny Lund and Marvin Patch, as the 1963 Ford Galaxy won the season's Daytona 500 and the Owners' Championship. And the colors on this car, they look really great. You got the cream color, you got the burgundy color, they really mesh really well. My only gripe with this car is, looking at the actual thing, they don't have the 410 horsepower on the hood. That's really the only minor inaccuracy there is, and after that, it's worthy of the time capsule tier. Wood Brothers Racing, they just keep going strong, and this is no exception. Shell Pennzoil has had some killer throwback schemes, whether it's the Steve Park Tribute or the Bobby Labonte Xfinity car. For 2020, the Ford Mustang tributes to Bobby Allison's number 22, driven during the 1985 NASCAR Cup Series season. I'm honestly surprised Miller didn't run this with Brad Keselowski beforehand. And honestly, I wish they would have done that, as even with the same number, they managed to screw up the font horribly on this car. And it's a shame, because they seemingly got everything else correct, but it's just that one thing that makes it look like one of Joey Logano's Coca-Cola 600 schemes rather than a car tributing Bobby Allison. That definitely hurts this car a lot, so it's going in the historically inaccurate tier. The newest NASCAR Cup Series winner will also take part in the Jimmy Johnson Parade. The Liberty University 24 will be painted, or may I say wrapped in this case, in the form of Jimmy Johnson's 2013 Power of Pride scheme. This was a car that granted Jimmy Johnson his 4th All-Star win, the most all-time in the event's over 30-year history. And now, debate all you want that there were millions of better Johnson schemes to choose from. I mean, I was a bit disappointed when the reveal got leaked. Especially, this is a 24, you gotta have neon yellow numbers, and the fact that you had so many Jimmy Johnson paint schemes that had neon yellow numbers, and yet they used this car from 2013. However, I understand it fits the company colors, and besides the Liberty logo placed on the hood, you have a car that's going to look stout to open up the NASCAR playoffs. So therefore, this one's good enough to go in the time capsule tier. JJ Yeley is going to be shooting for victory lane, or should I say a top 35 finish, with this lime green 27. The late great Kenny Irwin sported this colorful design in 1997, and believe it or not, this paint scheme has never raced in a NASCAR race. The David Blair 27 failed to make the show at Rockingham, which was the only event in which this car ever hit the track. And now, there aren't very many pictures of this car in real life besides the front, so I can only go off of the diecast render, and looking at that, this car is a bit historically inaccurate. There was supposed to be a bit of purple on the backside of the car, as well as a bit of orange, and that isn't the case on the actual car compared to the diecast. So while it's going to be an eye-catching idea, and it's very creative, I gotta put this one into the historically inaccurate tier. You know what's weirder than seeing an Elliott Sadler throwback? How about 2 throwbacks to a mediocre NASCAR Cup driver? This design is the clean red rookie car Sadler drove in both 1999 and 2000. So, I guess it's fitting rookie John Hunter Nemechek is going to sport this on his City Guard 38. And now, this car looks pretty well, as it seems like they got the logos right, they got the font right, but at the end of the day, it's just a plain red car. There's really nothing of significant historical value, or it's not one of those eye-catching paint schemes that you instantly notice on the track. I feel like the Wood brothers themselves would have done so much better with this throwback, so honestly, I'm going to put this one pretty low in the faded paint tier. On the flip side, Haas does such a great job knocking throwbacks out of the park, and the 2020 design is no exception. Cole Custer will tribute to the late great Curtis Turner. The car models his 1965 Ford Galaxy, the same one he raced in his final NASCAR Cup season. And like the 2018 and 2019 schemes, this car is replicated to almost perfection. The red looks accurate, the gold name on the side door, and even the number and side sponsor mimic the exact same car Curtis drove. Stewart-Haas Racing this season, they did an exceptional job with all 4 of their throwback schemes. And with this fantastic throwback to one of NASCAR's figures of the 1960s, I gotta put this one in the History on Wheels tier. If you've been binge watching this channel since June, you'll be able to recognize the Bubba Wallace throwback. It's the Richard Petty ride-by paint scheme, the one time the King didn't drive the Petty Blue 43, and instead drove the green number 6 owned by DK Ulrich. But compared to that car, there is one major flaw on the 2020 version. Not only does the green look a bit inaccurate, going more with a Cash App brightness than the faded green, but there's this weird looking gradient that goes from the nose to the front wheel. I really like that they did this paint scheme, but I wish they would have done it a lot better, and honestly, I've got to stick this one in the middling historically inaccurate category. And it sucks to say, but it's probably the worst Richard Petty Motorsports throwback, as the other ones have been near perfection. But I guess all great things are supposed to come to an end. That isn't the only Richard Petty themed throwback, as now enter the 7-time champion Jimmy Johnson. But instead, for his final Southern 500, he is going to salute both Dale Earnhardt and Richard Petty with this combo paint scheme. Once again, another classy gesture from the El Cajon, California native. And when I look at this car is nothing short of groundbreaking for the throwback game. I mean, Ally, I know I give them a hard time on some of their paint schemes, but this one they absolutely crushed. They had the correct Richard Petty Motorsports number font, as well as the STP logo on the hood. And then they also had the Richard Childress Racing font, and even slanted it in the right way. And then the final thing is, they did a fantastic job fitting both paint schemes in. They didn't try to force things in, they just let things happen naturally, and that really makes it one of the more groundbreaking paint schemes. And this one's going to be remembered for a couple decades, and most certainly this is going in the History on Wheels tier. For once, Ally Racing, great job. Next up, from Rickware Racing, we've got this Joey Gase throwback. This car is modeled off of Bobby Allison's Coca-Cola paint scheme, which is such a great design. You've got the gold and the red, and it definitely stands out from a crowd. But honestly, without the Coca-Cola branding, this car doesn't look very good. And I hate when small teams do this. They sit there and do a paint scheme, that some other teams already done. Tony Stewart already did this paint scheme in 2016, and it looked 10,000 times better than this. I mean, there's so much history they can delve into with the smaller teams, and they did that with some of their other drivers, and this one just doesn't look as good, so I'm going to have to put this one in the faded paint tier. Do something original. Fortunately, the next Rick Ware Racing design is, as this is James Davison's number 53 Signing Day Sports Camaro for this weekend's Southern 500. This car tributes Tom Sneva and one of his rare NASCAR starts in the number 53. And considering that James Davison raced in the Indy 500, he's raced some open wheel cars, it's really cool to see him tribute Tom Sneva, who did the same. And as for the car, they got the color right, the logo right, and the font right. So Rick Ware Racing, instantly, they redeemed themselves, so I've got to put this one in the time capsule tier. The Skull Bandit is back with Timmy Hill. His roofclaim.com Toyota Camry tributes Phil Parsons and his 1984 paint scheme, and when looking at this paint scheme, MBM Motorsports did a fantastic job replicating the green, white, and gold design to this Toyota Camry. And that even includes the awesome hood logo to this car. This one is definitely an underrated gem, and I don't do this to a lot of small team paint schemes, but they crushed this one out of the park. So I gotta put this one in the History on Wheels tier. Ross Chastain and Spire Motorsports have a pretty cool throwback they're going to be racing this Sunday night. This car is, believe it or not, a tribute to Dale Sr. This red, gold, and blue car drove during the 1976 season. And I think one other thing significant about this car is Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s radio station, Dirty Mo Radio, will be sponsoring this car. And compared to the kinda weird MRN radio throwback, this one is absolutely knocked out of the park by Spire Motorsports. I mean, you look at the two cars, there's almost nothing wrong with it, and the colors absolutely stand out. And I didn't even know this was one of Dale Sr.'s paint schemes, but my goodness, this car is massively underrated. Thank goodness it'll be hitting the track, albeit it will probably go a couple laps down. But after that, this car definitely goes in the History on Wheels tier. And now we get to the final car of the Jimmie Johnson trilogy. Alex Bowman is going to be running the car I like to call the Dynasty scheme. This was Jimmie Johnson's most dominant era. He won a lot of races, and this was one of his most staple paint schemes with the blue, the silver, and the black. And then of course you got that neon yellow, that standout color that you can see from a mile away. But after the nostalgia settles, I'm going to be honest, Hendrick Motorsports screwed up with this car. Once again, like the Chase Elliott car, they screwed up with the font. Seriously, how does a team like Hendrick Motorsports, they're able to use the fonts of a currently rivaling team in the garage for Jimmie Johnson's throwback, but yet they can't use the Hendrick fonts they own on the 9 and 88. And the thing is, with the 9 car, it wasn't that big of a deal. With this car, considering Jimmie Johnson had the number 48, seeing the 88 used with the Dale Jr. font, it just looks awful. I feel like this car would have been way better replicated on William Byron's car rather than Alex Bowman. So I'm going to be really harsh on this car. They struck out, and I'm going to put this one on the historically inaccurate tier. But in the end, Hendrick Motorsports had a pretty good throwback year, and they got to send off Jimmie Johnson pretty well. It was way better than Jeff Gordon's final throwback weekend, as even his own sponsor on the 24 car, they didn't want to do a throwback. So, we all know Levine Family Racing is turning in the key, so it's the perfect time to bust out this scheme from the vault. Or they could just throw back to Christopher Bell's Truck Championship in 2017. The thing about recent throwbacks is, they'd be a lot cooler if they were actually done right. Despite having JBL and Procore as sponsors, the 95 has red in substitute for the orange, and once again it ruins the credibility of this scheme. This car is just so bad on so many levels, so awful, and so this definitely goes in the colorblind section. Hopefully in another 20 or 30 years when Christopher Bell maybe wins a NASCAR championship, they'll do a hell of a lot better throwing back to his truck championship. And then finally, taking a similar path as Daniel Suarez. Going with the theme of Champions Weekend, we have the 2016 Xfinity Winning Era scheme. A car that will give both Daniel Suarez haters and Carl Edwards fans some major PTSD. And I know, this car ran a couple years ago and people are probably sick of it. But the people at CommScope, the people at Gaunt Brothers Racing did a great job throwing back to that 2016 championship. And there's pretty much nothing wrong with this car. So I'm going to end things out with a bang, and we're going to put this car in the history on wheels tier. Compared to some other throwback years, this one was a little bit worse than usual. Besides the Hendrick Motorsports throwbacks, the Stewart-Haas racing schemes, and then I'd say the Kyle Busch car, there's not really much that's going to stand out compared to, say, 2019 and 2018. But at the very least, these teams actually did a throwback paint scheme, compared to Chris Buescher, Ricky Stenhouse Jr., and both Ganassi cars. But the one that struck out the most was Matt Kenseth. You have history with himself, you have history with McDonald's, you have history with both of them combined. And yet they're going to run the same generic McDelivery scheme. This just further adds to the misfortunate legacy of McDonald's and NASCAR. So anyways, this is NRF signing out, and just remember, life's a beach and then you drive.